I'm the moderator of this presentation. We're going to go just simply in the order of the way people sat down. And so that Matt Duffin will speak first. He's going to talk about ethical considerations in using waterboarding and other extreme interrogation methods to protect life. Rodger Broome is using I don't know if I can even pronounce it, a phenomenological-psychology approach to explore the lived experience of police uses of deadly force. Eric Russell will discuss the effect that servant leadership can have on emergency personnel perception of the role and characteristics of a leader. And Jeff Maxfield will examine the use of discussion and critical reflection in the delivery of online courses to adult learners. And if there's still time, I might do something on mass media coverage of disasters. We'd like to have an opportunity for you to ask questions, and so we'll give you some of that time at the end. We really appreciate all of you that have come at quite a distance to our presentation. We'll go now with Matt, if you would.
Okay. So what I'm here to talk about today is really about the issue of torture and whether torture ever can be legally or ethically or morally justified. And that issue really came to the forefront during the beginnings of the War on Terror. You know, there was a time in which, during the Bush administration, after 9/11, after the Twin Towers had gone down, we'd gone into Afghanistan, we'd captured a lot of people. And they had brought them back to Guantanamo Bay or wherever they were holding them, working with these people, trying to collect important information that they hoped would help lead them to capture Osama bin Laden. Well, it got to the point where nothing was being collected. These people were not talking. And yet we knew they had great intelligence, great information. And so the Bush administration, with all the pressure in the country, the pressure in Congress to stop an attack like this from ever happening again, looked to other techniques or other tactics that they might be able to use in order to get these people to start talking. Now the issue isn't so much, I mean, a lot of people will talk about torture from the perspective of, well, when you're talking about torture, you know, if you're going to torture somebody, they're going to lie to you, right? Well, just talking to somebody, they're going to lie to you. Some people lie when you're just asking them questions. Some people tell the truth when you're asking them questions. Some people lie when you torture them. Some people tell the truth when you torture them. And so the issue for interrogators really isn't so much this issue of torture, it's more collecting information and then going out and being able to use that information to go back and verify whether something is true or not. So, you know, you can really throw out that issue of torture and truth as to whether, you know, that's really a red herring here when we're talking about this whole issue of torture. Now, do I believe things like waterboarding are torture? Absolutely, without question. I was an attorney in the Defense Department. I was working actually in the Air Force. I was a JAG. I was one of the first JAGs in the Pentagon who saw a memo came across my desk related to enhanced interrogation tactics. And I went to the top Air Force lawyer, the TJAG, and we went forward with an opinion to the Department of Defense that we felt that several of the top interrogation tactics were illegal, that they would be torture under the International Torture Statute. There's no question in my mind that taking somebody and putting them with their head down, putting it and tying their hands together, putting a wet cloth over their eyes and their mouth, and then pouring water into their mouth and over their nose, creates such an intense feeling of fear that the person is going to die that, yeah, that's, I mean, if anyone were to do that to you or to I, that would be an unlawful act. That would be something that they could be criminally prosecuted for. So there's no doubt in my mind, whether you call it torture or whether you call it an unlawful act, that's truly an unlawful act. You can't do that to another human being. That's immoral, it's wrong. So in that sense, then, how could the U.S. ever do something like that to a human being and to another individual? There's something really important for you to understand in regard to that, and that really comes down to the issue of another thing that we look at both from a moral perspective and from a legal perspective, which is the law of self-defense. You know, if you look at that from a natural law perspective, there are people who say that that right cannot be trumped, that your right of self-defense can never be taken from you, even if there's some law that's written by some legislature or some international law that's written by a bunch of countries. They cannot abrogate, they cannot take away that right of self-defense from you. And so how does the law of self-defense work? Well, if you are threatened with any sort of imminent harm or danger, you have the right, the natural law right, to respond in equal force, or in fact even greater force, whatever is necessary for you to protect yourself. And when we look at it from U.S. law or from any other countries, most other countries' law, that means if you are threatened with deadly force, you can respond with deadly force. That means that if somebody threatens you with a gun, you can pull out a bazooka and you can blow them away. And guess what? That is 100% lawful. Now, if you took out a bazooka here in this company, nobody's pointing a gun at you, and you shoot it up here, or if I were to shoot it down into the crowd here, I would have committed murder, right? But if I am defending myself and I kill another human being, that is called self-defense, and that's a human right. That's a human right that cannot be abrogated. We have the right to defend ourselves. Okay. So let's take a look at that from the perspective of what some people call torture. And I did call waterboarding torture. I don't call it torture in the way that other people call it torture, because what the Bush administration did, I don't believe was torture. I believe it was self-defense. Now, why is that? Okay, if you look at what somebody's doing in the law or in morals or ethics, you know, if I were to have a gun and I were at a firing range, and it was an indoor range, and somebody had spilled a Coke or something on the floor, and I'm walking down there with my gun, and I'm doing everything safe with it, or I'm just backing up from the firing range, I'm doing everything safe, just backing up for a minute, maybe I have to scratch my ear or something, and I slip on that Coke that was on the floor, and I fall down, and you know what? My finger accidentally hits the trigger, and the gun goes off, and it kills the guy right next door to me. Have I committed murder? I've killed another human being. I used my finger to pull the trigger of a gun, and I killed another human being. Am I guilty of murder? No. We look at intent. Intent in the law is everything. It's not the act itself. And so what you have to be careful with is that people don't make you think just because somebody has done some act that somehow it's immoral. Just because they've done some act that somehow... You have to look at the intent. So what happened with the waterboarding that the U.S. did? It essentially was a ticking time bomb situation. For all we knew, there were other terrorists out there who were going to attack the United States, who were going to come into the United States and kill innocent children, innocent women, innocent men, unarmed people, people who weren't even attacking them, and they were going to kill them with the intent of spreading fear and terror within our civilian population. And so, the Bush administration felt that the threat was imminent, that it was a danger, and so they took action. Now, they didn't just go out and kill these terrorists in these circumstances, and they didn't go out and get a rubber hose and beat them bloody just for the fun to watch them suffer in pain. It's not what the things of the Bush administration are not like the things that they've done to U.S. soldiers over the years. Like the presidential candidate, now his name slips my mind, who was in the Vietnam War, John McCain. He was beat almost every day. He was tortured, wire-shocked. But what purpose did the Vietnamese torture him for? It wasn't for intelligence. It was just for the fun of just being cruel and mean. And that's not what the Bush administration did. What they did was they waterboarded these guys, and there were 3 of them who were waterboarded. And according to what has been unclassified, because they got intelligence out of those men, they were able later to capture several key Al-Qaeda members. and probably very likely prevented future attacks on the United States. Now, we can't look at all the intelligence. It's been classified and they haven't released it. But you know what? We do know that this does work. There was an Israeli Corporal Nashon Waxman who was kidnapped by some terrorists, Hamas. The Israelis captured the kidnapped vehicle driver. And they were just torn as to what to do. They thought this guy was going to be killed. So what they did was they tortured the driver, and guess what? They found out the location of where this corporal was. Now, the Israelis went in, and when they went in, they tried to rescue him. They botched the rescue attempt, and he was killed. But tell me that's not self-defense. You tell me that's not self-defense. I just can't accept it. If somebody is threatening you with death, why can't you take some lesser means, which we would call actually assault? And so, my last point would be, when people have been waterboarded, there was a guy who actually waterboarded his kid to get his kid to do her homework or something like that. That person was charged with assault. They were properly prosecuted for assault. He was a criminal. But that's essentially all this is. Waterboarding is assault. It's the crime of assault. And I think you can commit an assault to prevent a murder. Thank you.
Okay. The project of descriptive phenomenological method in psychology is to provide us a way of researching the lived experiences of people from the subjective perspective. As a point of clarification, the term subjective or subjectivity in phenomenology means from the first-person position of the research participant. Therefore, phenomenological psychologists attempt to assume an empathetic position to his or her research participants rather than standing from a third-person position outside or above the person. As an analogy, the method is intended to act as a kind of psychological helmet cam that views the lived experience from the participant's point of view. Amedeo Giorgi began developing the descriptive phenomenological method in psychology around 40 years ago. The method is guided by Edmund Husserl's philosophical phenomenology that he himself hoped to establish as an eidetic science for the social sciences. Husserl likened the need for an eidetic science to guide the social science to the way in which pure geometry and pure mathematics directs the natural or physical sciences such as physics, chemistry, biology, etc. For example, the true point, line, or plane are geometrical figures that we accept as real or sound theory, but we cannot represent them according to their definitions in the physical world. When we put a point on a piece of paper with a pencil, it still has diameter. When we draw a line, we still get a line with width. When we describe a plane, we cannot find an object that has a two-dimensional surface without still having depth in our three-dimensional environment. But we accept these geometrical principles even though we cannot experience them directly through our five senses. Phenomenology is the philosophical study of the structure of human consciousness and how it acts in its correlative relationship with the life world of the person. Phenomenological psychology is the method of inquiry guided by the values and theories of phenomenology. Descriptive phenomenological psychology aims at the psychology of the living person in everyday activities and experiences. Our everyday understanding of the world is what Husserl called the natural attitude, which involves our culturally influenced understandings of the people, things, and states of affairs of our life worlds. Phenomenological psychology takes the narrative account of a person that lived through a particular experience and analyzes it as it was experienced by the person. Through adapting the epoche, or assuming the phenomenological attitude, the researcher sets aside his or her own natural attitude to see the experience through the eyes of the participant telling the story. This means that the researcher reviews the account without interpreting what the participant is saying through his or her own understanding. In other words, the researcher brackets or sets in suspension his or her own knowledge about the topic under study until a full psychological description can be brought forth through the additional 4 steps of the 5-step method. The 5-step method produces a set of constituents or psychological aspects that are essential to that kind of experience. We call these psychological aspects constituents rather than elements because these are always context dependent in the person and situation framework. Once the constituents are assembled into a general structure, this set of constituents serves as a descriptive psychological results that can now be discussed theoretically or interpretively. Once having a description, the researcher can bring out his or her bracketing the interpretive modes and of theorizing and unpack and elucidate the experience to its fullest extent. There is not enough time to go into any detail and deal with all the phenomenological principles that are implemented to gain a deeper and richer understanding of the participants' experiences. However, suffice it to say that it is understood that in phenomenological psychology, when somebody says something, they say more than what the simple words mean. In other words, what we say is always pregnant with more meaning than we ourselves even realize on a regular basis. The descriptive general structure gives the scientific community something upon which to make critical commentaries. I apply the descriptive phenomenological method to public safety psychology. I have conducted studies on police high-speed pursuits, scenario-based firearms training, and real police shootings. Of course, these are very controversial topics in society because they can result in property damage, injuries, and death. Public safety workers are responsible for protecting and saving lives, so these decisions are made in the contexts that are often dynamic, unpredictable, and rapidly evolving and definitely life-changing. The first-person perspectives of the officers who are involved in such events involve thoughts, anticipations, motivations, anxieties, and other rich psychological phenomena. But beyond such nominal categories, we can see the personal meanings of various aspects of their experience that give us an idea of what it is like for the officer in the situation. For example, in my recent study on police deadly force, I found what I call the deadly force paradox that emerges from the officer in the shoot or be killed moment. The deadly force paradox emerges in the experience of the officer as the officer's awareness of the bodily damage he or she is inflicting on the suspect is both horrific but simultaneously significant of his or her survival of the lethal encounter. In other words, seeing the wounds and the collapse of the suspect also means seeing one's own salvation from death. It becomes psychologically bittersweet because the gory details become the personal signs of life for the officer. Moreover, the mortal wounds present themselves to the officer as a reminder of his or her own mortality and the near miss he or she just lived through. The moment becomes extremely important to how the officer personally understands and reconciles his or her own experience in the post-shooting reflections and coping through having faced almost being murdered and having killed another person to avoid it. The space does not exist here for further elaboration or how this fits into the larger holistic frame of the police shooting experience, but it serves as a slice of the pie that may introduce the method's importance to such topics as these. Every day, our media and entertainment depict or report on some police, fire, or emergency medical event because it is of interest to us. But these commentaries are often laden with oversimplifications, rhetoric, and sensationalized in a manner that distorts or covers over the lived realities of those who suffer such experiences. Phenomenological psychology's contribution to society is to provide the responders, policymakers, clinicians, and the general public with insights to the events that are not otherwise known from the position of a third-party witness. We can see the events through the responder's eyes by taking empathetic, qualitative stance to psychological research in their lived experiences to see what it was like for them. Thanks.
Hi. My name is Eric Russell. I'm with the Department of Emergency Services as well. I'm going to go in a different direction. My field that I like to study and that I'm opening up to the emergency services is servant leadership and the firefighter and the emergency service worker. Originally, the topic of servant leadership came from a man by the name of Rodger Broome. He was a Quaker, and he wrote an essay back in 1970 called Servant as Leader. And it comes from a book that Hermann Hesse wrote called The Journey to the East. I don't know if any of you have read that book here at the university. And what it says is there's two different ways that somebody comes into being a leader. One is they come in from a desire to lead. That desire comes from a wanting of either A, money, or B, power. Like it or not, that's what that is. And it's not as harsh as you think. Now, servant leadership, Greenleaf's argument is the servant leader comes to leadership from a desire to serve. Okay? And it is from that desire to serve that they grow into wanting to be a leader. Where this fits into the emergency services is it's that same desire to serve, that same desire that brings the individual into the career field. And within the emergency services career field, you really don't become a leader in the emergency services unless you've already been a follower in the emergency services. So the first thing that I have going on in my research is developing a model based on Patterson's constructs of the servant leader, and to identify the characteristics within the fire and emergency services, both student and professional, what brings them into the career field, and then trying to mesh those two things together to come up with a model in which to study the emergency services. Whereas you can identify the characteristics and constructs of servant leadership within that individual who came to the career field from a desire to serve. The other thing that I have going on right now is the influential aspects of servant leadership as pedagogy. There's not a lot of work that's been done on the ability to change somebody's perspective, to change them as leaders. And when you look at the toxic environment that we see in our country, in business and government, public and private, for-profit and non-profit, you wouldn't have a lot of the problems that you have today if people had more education. And that has been the argument of several dissertations that have come out lately, is people come to leadership and they come to being leaders from their lived experiences and not from an education or a teaching. So that means it's a failure on us. It's a failure on academia to identify specific pedagogies and ensure that they're being delivered to our students. Because the truth is a lot of people that go out there and they function within society, they're coming out of universities. Okay? And if they're coming out of universities, they're not being taught the things that they need to know. They're not being taught the things that will help them act in an honest and forthright and truthful way. Then we're failing as academics. And that's not saying that servant leadership is the only answer. It's saying that if we're not training people to be true leaders, then we're failing at our jobs. So the first thing in building that model involves the constructs that Patterson identified out of Greenleaf's writings. She identified them back in 2003. There's 7 specific constructs. The first is agapeo love. You've heard of agape love, which is a love from God. Agapeo love is a love that comes for morality. It comes from ethics. The next is humility, then altruism, but not altruism as in you're just going to hand over everything that you own to somebody else. It's a completely different aspect. Vision, trust, empowerment, and service. Now, when you take the first one, agapeo love, when love is what has to come from the leader, you have to have a love of the individuals that are your followers. You have to have a love for your society in which you serve. If you don't have that love, how can you possibly serve it? Okay? Because the only way, and the love isn't a romantic love. A love isn't, oh, I want to take you out. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that you have these feelings inside of you that you care for these people. Honestly, deeply, you care for their future, you care for their improvement and their growth. Okay? As far as humility, this in the emergency services, what we're seeing is the humility is how you come to taking care of these individuals. It's lowering yourself into their position because they have invited you in the most drastic and dire situations of their lives. When they dial 911 and the emergency service responder goes out, they are dealing with a person in their most vulnerable state. You have to realize that you have humbled yourself to go into this situation. You are not above them. You are not better than them. It is an act of humility. As far as altruism, in the emergency services, the greatest altruistic act one can give is to lay down their life for another. The motto of the Air Force Fire Emergency Services, where I come from, is so others may live. That's what that is. It's giving of oneself. It's sacrificing of oneself to be a public servant, to help. The next is vision. Vision, from the emergency services standpoint, can deal with seeing what's needed in the future. It's seeing what's needed for your people, but it's also seeing what's needed for your community. It's being intelligent and looking at the needs of a community and not just what you think they need. It's taking in all of the information and getting out there and dealing with the people. It's also a vision of the need of your followers. What education do they need? What training do they need? Where are they going to go, and how are you going to keep the butts in the seats in the future? Because these are the cuts that are happening around the country. From the emergency service leadership standpoint, a lot of leaders have failed in having a vision of justifying the occupation as a paid profession going into the future. The next is trust. Trust is an absolute. Patterson said the only thing that you can deal with in society is trust of each other. The only thing in the emergency services is the trust of your people. Do you trust them? Do you trust them to be there? Do you trust that they themselves are actually going in and doing the training, getting the certifications, and paying attention to what they need to do in order to be the best, so you can rely on them and they can rely on you? The trust is the backbone of the relationship. It involves communication. What Patterson basically said out of Greenleaf's lecture, it was trust. And in the emergency services, because of the teamwork that has to happen, trust is there as well. The next is empowerment. In the emergency services career field in law enforcement, you are empowered as a junior officer or as a patrolman to go out there and be an extension of the people who are in charge. They are empowering you to make decisions. You're making calls on how you want to deal with people on scene, how you're going to deal with a fire, how you're going to deal with a law enforcement situation. You have been empowered by people who make a lot more money and have a higher position than you do. All of those 6 lead into the 7th construct, which is service. It's that desire to serve. And that desire to serve is what Greenleaf goes back to, says that desire to serve is what builds your desire to lead. And it's not from ever wanting to be a leader, but it's through that service, how you come into the career field, how you go through that agape love, that humility, that altruism, that trust, and that empowerment, how you receive it and you can see how it can be given as well, that desire to serve comes from, and therefore the leader comes out of. It is a completely different way of looking at leadership. The next is dealing with leadership as a pedagogy, and teaching servant leadership as a pedagogy. And the purpose is to explore how participation in servant leadership pedagogy influences the emergency services learners' vision of both the role and characteristics of a leader. Think about it. Every single one of you can sit here right now and say, this is what I envision a leader to be. A lot of the things that you'll say come out of that great man, and that could be great human, okay, position of a person who is powerful, who is strong, who is there for their people. However, these are all things that we've taken from our experiences in life and things that we've seen that we've put forth to what a leader should be. However, there are specific characteristics of a leader. There are specific constructs of a leader that haven't been identified. So the best thing to do as far as emergency services research is concerned is to identify how students perceive leadership before they're ever out in the field and before they ever do any work whatsoever. And can that perception, can that vision be transformed? Which Ken Blanchett said is the absolute power of servant leadership, is it has an ability to transform. And the question is can that transform somebody's perception to what a role and a characteristic of a leader is? Do they take on a different persona of a leader, and will that affect them as a leader in the future? And that's the goal of that research, is to understand it. So for servant leadership in emergency services, we're looking at building a model in order to do studies with, and the other is to understand the influence of servant leadership as pedagogy. Thanks.
As you can see, there's quite a different mix of disciplines and problems associated with the emergency services. My interest is in how to educate people to those things using the best and most effective way to get the students to learn and be able to apply the information that they gain. I'm going to preface my remarks here first with, this is my opinion. And I say that because I'm going to offer some things that may go against what a lot of other people view as far as pedagogy and teaching of students. Back in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages basically, the only ones who really knew how to read and write were the monks, who were translating scriptures and writings from ancient times. And what they would do is take a promising student and teach them through rote memorization and writing things out, how to read and write, to continue that process. As it became evident that society needed education, the same use or technology or pedagogy, if you will, was used on students to teach them to memorize things, to write out things, and consequently, for about the last 700 years, that's how we have taught our students. I submit to you that that is not very effective, particularly in higher education. Now, I know many of you students here I know you have this philosophy because I get it from a lot of my students. Just tell me what I need to know to get a passing grade on the test. And that's what we have developed, is someone that just wants to know the facts and figures to pass a test, but they don't really get education. There is a terminology that became more popular in the 1970s called andragogy. Pedagogy, basically, if it's literally translated, means train the child or teach the child. Andragogy means teach the adult, teach the man. And there is a difference in philosophy in teaching to adults effectively than there is to younger children. And an interesting fact here at UVU that many of you probably don't know, but nearly half of the students here at UVU, I think it's about 42%, are considered non-traditional adult students, meaning that they're over the age of 25, they're married, have jobs, careers, everything else, and they're trying to get an education. They have a different need for education than just learning facts and figures to pass a test. And so I'd like to explain what we do in the emergency services for the most part in the School of Public Services is we try to give an experiential-based learning as well as facts and figures. I'm a believer that we learn or we construct our own knowledge or learning by our experiences, our paradigms, everything that comes to us. All of you have different experiences, different cultural backgrounds and things, and you view your world through those lenses. And that's okay, because that's how you're going to assimilate your knowledge, is through those lenses. So in essence, you get to construct your own learning based on how it fits your needs and your social roles. Years ago, and I don't know if any of you have heard of this or not, there's a learning modality called Bloom's taxonomy. Basically, a bunch of educators got together and said, how do people learn? And they came up with 3 topics or 3 themes of how most people learn. It is the cognitive domain, which is remembering, recalling, reproducing something. The affective, that's with an A, affective domain, which emphasizes feelings, emotions, attitudes, and that. And then there's the psychomotor domain, which is the hands-on, learn how to do something. Unfortunately, all of the concentration, because it's easy to quantify and easy to study, that, well, I won't say all, but most of what researchers have done is in the cognitive domain. How you remember things and you can regurgitate it. Hence, why you take exams and why you want to know, just give me the stuff I need to pass the exam. How well can you memorize it and then regurgitate it on a test? But I'd ask you to think about something. How long do you remember it after the test? A couple of weeks, maybe? I see some smiles, so I know that's true. What we would like to do is introduce you to a concept that will help you remember and apply all of that education so that you come out of here without an education, not just a degree. And a lot of the work that I've done is in the affective domain, and using reflection and reflective practice to get people to learn better. There's a British researcher named Peter Jarvis who developed a thought process. Everything we do is in a social context. You learn by experiences with other people in situations that you're in. It's all social. And he developed 9 steps of learning that you can go through in your social aspect. And I'd just like to identify them for you right now real quickly. The first is presumption. And that's just a mechanical response that you assume that what has previously worked will work again. You don't even give it much thought, you just do it. Number 2 is non-consideration, and usually you're too busy or too preoccupied with something to really give it a lot of thought, so it doesn't have any meaning to you. The third is rejection, and that's a conscious thought. I don't buy this, and so you reject it out of hand. What Peter Jarvis says is basically in those first 3 responses, no learning is taking place, or very, very little learning. The next 3 are pre-conscious, and that's when you just unconsciously internalize something. For example, if you're traveling down the road, you reach up and adjust the volume on the radio. Half the time you don't remember even doing that. It just was something you did. Practice is the next one, and that's like practicing the piano. You do it until it's learned. And memorization, which is what most of you do to try and pass an exam, is memorize facts or figures or processes, things of that nature. Peter Jarvis says that some learning takes place there, but not very much. A little editorial comment, this is where I believe most education is they make you practice and memorize. So there is some learning, but not a lot. The next 3 is where learning really takes place, and that's contemplation. You actually take the time to think about what's being presented. Contemplate it. The next one is the reflective practice, and that's similar to problem solving. You reflect on what will work and what has worked in your life and how you would apply it. And the last one, which gets to the very essence of learning, is to experiment with those reflective things that you've done. Actually go out and try different things to see if they work. Those last 3 are where Peter Jarvis, and I agree with this, where most of your learning takes place. So reflective practice is very important in the emergency services, because how do we know what's going to happen in the future and how we can respond to that? Well, the best way is by reflecting on what has worked in the past and actually reflecting to the future, or portending, if you will, what's going to happen. Problem solve the future if possible. We have a lot of our courses that have a lot of reflective activity. We require students to write papers. Ooh, you hate that, don't you? As an instructor, I hate having to read them, but it's how I learn that you know what you're talking about. I don't know that you learned anything when you pass a test other than the facts and figures. But if you have to write to me to tell me how to apply the principle or concept, I can see whether you're learning or not. Another thing we do is journaling. You have to keep a journal of what you're learning as you're learning it and submit it to the instructors. And that gives us a better idea of what you're thinking and how, so that we can guide or actually learn ourselves from something that you may have. We do things like problem-based and case study-based learning, where you have to actually look at a case study and determine what learning things are in there that will apply to you. And I can honestly tell you, most of our classes are online, and that in and of itself creates a whole different aspect we could talk about. But most of the students in our class start out thinking, I'm not really going to learn a lot because it's online. And they're thinking that it's the typical online class where you read a bunch of stuff, you take a quiz, you do it at your own pace, and I don't learn anything. Most of our classes are not like that. They're very interactive. You must have a conversation with other students. You must submit your papers, get them graded. You must document where you got your sources and things like that. In the surveys we've done with our students, most of them come back and say, I cannot believe how much I learned and how great this class was. And I think it's based on the fact that we're giving you things that are applicable to your life, that you can apply right now, not necessarily in the future, and we're making you think critically. I believe personally we've lost that in higher education. We don't teach critical thinking, we teach skills memorization. Thank you.
I think it's time to have some questions. They're going to say this is a cop-out on my part.
Cop out.
Matt Duffin teaches in our criminal justice program. One question I had is waterboarding really dangerous?
Well, you could kill somebody doing it, but if it's done properly, then no. I mean, if you get to the point where, I mean, when you're waterboarding somebody, you don't keep pouring the water over their face longer than probably 15 or 20 seconds. Most people can't stand it more than 5 or 6 seconds. You'd think that, you know, you can hold your breath. Some people can hold their breath for a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes. I mean, you see people who swim all the time, can swim the length of the pool, maybe depending on how long the pool is, maybe they can come back. You can't do that when you're being waterboarded because your head is down. What ends up happening is your lungs fill up with carbon dioxide quicker. And for some reason, there's some sort of a sensory thing going on in your body. It sends an immediate signal to your brain. You are drowning. And it just starts freaking you out. So most people can't stand it for more than 5 or very most 10 seconds. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Questions? Oh, Mary?
I had a couple of thoughts as I was listening. Are you saying that basically the difference between us and them, meaning those who use torture against POWs, US POWs, is to what extent we use things like waterboarding?
No, it goes back to the intent and the purpose behind why you do something. If you look at people who have been tortured, U.S. prisoners who've been tortured, the Geneva Conventions has really never protected the U.S. If you look at everybody who's been tortured, it's always been a U.S. soldier, usually. They haven't tortured them for the purpose of gaining legitimate intelligence. One of the most extreme cases that came out of the Iraq War was Jessica Lynch. Remember her?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody talked about the torture she went through, but most of her injuries were due probably to being tortured, to being beaten, to being raped, and various other things. And it wasn't with intelligence in mind. It was for the pure pleasure of hurting another human being, somebody who was your enemy. And so, from the intent perspective of the law, and from the intent perspective of moral ethics or anything else, that's immoral. But I mean, people take it from the perspective of war itself. War is going out and killing other human beings, and yet, you know, soldiers who come home, and who have killed other human beings, we praise them, we thank them for their service. And we're grateful for their service because they protected our country from other people murdering or killing us. So there are acts out there that under law and under our views of moral and ethics, even though in some instances they would be wrong, in others they are legitimate and they are moral. And the problem is not letting somebody trick you into thinking something is immoral when it really isn't. It really requires that you have a focused attention on, well, what are the reasons behind why a person is doing what they're doing? What is the purpose of this?
Do you think that if we use such methods that those who are in charge of that could maintain that focus?
You know, I didn't get into my perspective of how do you handle this in an appropriate way in a democracy. I could talk for about an hour on that. There are some legal scholars who have proposed things like having torture warrants. Alan Dershowitz is one of the primary proponents of that. That makes a lot of sense. I think it has to be controlled. And it really wasn't out of control like the press was trying to claim. I mean, you had the impression that, hundreds of people were being tortured. And essentially there were only 3 people who were waterboarded. They were waterboarded numerous times, 50, 60 times before they finally broke. But there were only 3 that we know of that were waterboarded. And it required the actual permission of, people very, very high in the government. It wasn't like they delegated this authority to the local captain or lieutenant or whatever. It required very high level approval. So I don't really think we've had a case in the United States where this has been out of control. And people might point to things like, well, what happened over in Abu Ghraib? Wasn't that horrible? Yeah, but those people weren't given permission to do that. That wasn't authorized, and they were punished for it. So.
Rodger Broome teaches in our emergency management program. Rodger has been studying the use of deadly force in the police force. And the question that I had, what kind of psychological effects does that have on police? Have you just, at that stage, were you getting those findings?
Well, some of the things that we find are interesting about looking at the descriptive structure of it is that a lot of the distress or disruption that police officers will suffer in connection with the shooting is reflective. Actually, even going to a lot of what Dean Maxfield talked about reflection. Reflection is so much a part of how we learn to understand what we've been through. And the officers that I interviewed went through quite an extensive reflective process in the aftermath of their experience. One of the things that's important about the phenomenological method is that you start looking at those things that are not only real things that the officers suffered, but the things that were imaginative or part of their creative mind processes that actually created disturbances. For example, one of my participants talked about what it was like to wonder if his wife, how his wife felt about sleeping next to a killer, and whether she conceptualized him now as in that way. And also that maybe her behavior or some of her responses to his being involved in a shooting didn't seem quite as emergent or dramatic from her as he felt having been shot at with a handgun within range of 3 to 5 feet. So there was a lot of things that went into the disruption, the dreams. That particular participant went for a run after his experience the day after, and his shooting encounter with the criminal actually was preceded by a foot chase. And the minute he got his exercise stuff on and he went out and he took off running, he began to re-experience the flashes of the muzzle of the suspect's gun, started feeling again bodily the concussions of that flash. Again, being shot at from 3 to 5 feet with a very powerful handgun. Very, very disturbing. And then finally, the one constituent of the experience that I thought was really interesting was all of my participants did investigations of the suspects to find out what kind of people or who these people were that they shot and killed. Were they truly malevolent people, or were they people in a bad situation? Those kinds of things were the answers that they wanted. And 2 of my participants found that their adversaries were true blue criminals. They were druggies, they were peddling drugs, and they were doing so armed most of the time. In fact, one of the participants' adversaries had actually shot at his own common-law wife and child at one point out of anger. So those officers were able to kind of come to terms a little bit better with with the shootings that they had been involved in. But my other participant had shot somebody that had been deemed mentally disturbed. And so what that meant for the police department as a community and what that meant for my participant as an individual is that there became this dubiousness about the shooting itself, whether or not he had shot a bona fide malevolent bad guy or whether or not he had shot somebody that was possibly not in their right mind and maybe depressed or some of these other things. So really the mental model or the medical model of psychology, if you will, enters in. It's the mainstream model of how we understand mental disorders. And this entered into my participant's understanding of a shooting, that he possibly shot somebody who was actually the victim of a mental disorder rather than somebody who was truly an adversary. And so that shift in meaning there is really what the phenomenological method can bring out that most empirical methodologies won't attend to.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. Eric Russell teaches in our emergency management program. You talked in terms of being a follower in the fire service before becoming a leader. Does that, in fact, from your experience, make better leaders?
It depends. You know, a lot of the literature out there for fire and emergency service leadership development deals with management. And management is a process, it's not a way of being. So as far as the followership is concerned, where some people like Hyatt are arguing that they learned from their experiences, poor leaders actually had poor leaders. That was their experience, and that's how they became a poor leader. There's something to be said about leadership and followership and the power that a leader can instill on a follower. And a lot of times that leader doesn't realize that their actions are that powerful towards their followers. Because you can instill bad habits in individuals. It's something that you would see as irrelevant, meaningless situation. If they see you do it or they see that act, that individual who sees you as a leader, who sees you as somebody that they can look up to as a mentor, they then take that act into themselves, and they can do that within their profession. And once they get to that position, they now take on the persona of that toxic leader that they had to deal with. The idea of leadership and followership from the academic standpoint is to give the followers the tools and the education, expose them to what true, good, honest leadership is before they actually get out there within the career field, because that's when they're very vulnerable at that point, and that's where you develop most of your habits, is in the first 6 months to a year on the job. And that includes how you're going to approach leadership once you're in that position.
Thank you. Well, thank you for attending. I hope that this has been helpful to understand a little bit better some of the kinds of things that we're researching in the emergency services area. Thanks for coming.